Hello, everybody. My name is Tamara de Szegheo Lang, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about curating atmosphere, the moving image in queer community context. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I am grateful to be able to present to you on these lands, but also recognize the responsibility that comes along with being here. As a settler, I take this responsibility with me into my teaching, my research, and my curatorial practice. The topic of my talk today is queer curating, and especially queer curating within community-based archives. This is the theoretical background that I'm bringing with me to my work with the Under the Shadow of Empire project as it starts to get going. So I'm going to begin today with an example from Aleesa Cohene's work called Yes, Angel, because the affective compositional practice of Cohene's work is a condensation of the theory of queer curating and of queer atmospheres that I'm developing in this talk. Cohene has long been obsessed with popular Hollywood films from the 1980s and 1990s, especially romantic comedies, which are perhaps the most aggressively heterosexual of film genres. You wouldn't know it to see Cohene, a queer experimental filmmaker, but Cohene's fascination with Hollywood film is in line with a long history of queer reading practices. Many of us watch popular media that rarely represents us. We do this in strategic ways that fulfill a need for recognition and identification, or perhaps most usefully, the kinds of disidentifications that Jose Munoz writes about. After all, romantic comedies in the genre and history of melodramas are often linked with women viewers and seen as cinematically valueless. Cohene makes material queer reading practices and recuperates quote-unquote women's films through her meticulous construction of composite characters created through hundreds of clips from hundreds of films. She uses these composites to make queer characters, to draw attention to those who are made invisible in so much of mainstream film and TV. In Yes, Angel, the 4-channel film installation that grapples with the history of AIDS in America, Cohene creates 4 of these composite characters, representing 2 intergenerational relationships. Yes, Angel is 13 minutes long, but I'm going to show you a short clip to give you an idea of the ways in which she creates these composite characters from an archive of so many films, reworking the familiar into something unexpected. She does this through the manipulation of formal elements in order to meet a different outcome.
If the snake sheds his skin before a new skin is ready, naked he will be in the world, prey to the forces of chaos. Without his skin, he will be dismantled, lose coherence, and die.
Where you been? I was worried crazy.
I wouldn't make too much over this if I were you. I certainly know as much about what you do and have done as you think I do.
feels like. To be treated like some freak outcast from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed.
It never struck me that way.
So while Cohene's works do have a plot that slowly develops, they are much more driven by affect. The people making up the composite characters rarely resemble one another physically, except for a few common factors such as the predominance of whiteness and traditional forms of femininity or masculinity. But the viewer can suspend disbelief and see them as a single character because of Cohene's careful editing for emotional continuity throughout the scenes. There has been substantial interdisciplinary discussion on the difference and relation between the terms affect and emotion since the so-called affective turn in literary and cultural criticism of the 90s. There's now a standard distinction owing in large part to the work of Brian Masumi, that affect is intensity that circulates and touches down on our bodies, whereas emotion is something the subject makes from affect. We are affected or impacted, and we may come to narrate emotions from these rises and falls in affective intensity. Emotions like sadness, nostalgia, happiness, and the like are achievements of a subject. But curators and artists like Cohene can create atmospheres for intensities to circulate, where emotion might later be narrated and claimed by visitors. Emotion is certainly evoked through the expressions on the characters' faces in Yes, Angel, as you have seen. Facial expressions are a way we are taught early on to recognize and name emotions. Affective atmospheres, however, are created in part cinematically through mise en scène, including lighting, prop, and gesture, through camera movement, through the textures of the soundtrack. Color, for instance, becomes the glue between scenes. The affective atmospheres created by Yes, Angel also have a curatorial context. Cohene creates vivid atmospheres within her films, but also surrounding them in the broader installation. Yes, Angel, for instance, was created for the Coming After group exhibition on display at the Power Plant Gallery in downtown Toronto from 2011 to 2012. Within the exhibition, that as you see here, you come upon a small room with walls in a dark purple, marked with stars. Moving through the night sky, you come to a room with a row of benches, headphones, and 4 screens mounted to the wall, each representing a single composite character. The atmosphere for Cohene's work is dark and intimate. It's voyeuristic. You struggle a little to even see the images because even they are quite dark. The characters interact beyond, between screens, creating a story that is simultaneous, not sequential. The sound of the characters speaking and the narrator's deep timbre resonate around you. It plays with the senses. Not only the senses of sight and sound assumed when watching a film, but also smell. In recent years, Cohene has begun a scent art practice. For Yes, Angel, Cohene created a scent from gray mint, slate, aluminum, and orange rind, among other materials, meant to evoke the smell of blood so often linked with the AIDS crisis. Cohene's work is an immersive form of expanded cinema that encourages an embodied and affective experience. But affect and emotion are parsed in this installation, with the environment activating and extending the intensities created by the film, and thus charging the affect, while the emotional experience that visitors have in entering the affective atmosphere created by Cohene cannot be easily defined in advance. It is rather theirs formed from being affected. It is not an experience of learning about another person's emotional connection to history. This makes sense in the social context of a group exhibition united by the theme of a feeling, the feeling of coming after. the feeling of growing up in a queer world marked by the North American AIDS crisis, not directly as part of that experience, but as part of the aftermath. Most artists in the show were born in the 1970s and grew up aware of the crisis, if a little too young to have experienced it firsthand. The exhibit grapples with the feelings that go along with that relation to the recent past, of nostalgia, guilt, shame, and loss. Like Cohene's queer film practice, I would argue that the show as a whole, united by a complicated affective relationship to history rather than sexual identity strictly, is a queer curatorial practice, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. Throughout the rest of the talk, I argue that the staging of affective atmospheres is key in queer moving image curating, and that an attention to affect is useful in broader curating as well. Before we continue, I'm going to state how I define queer curating in conversation with how others have used the term. So in 2018, Canadian Art Magazine published a discussion amongst artists, curators, and organizers to ask them what queer curating is. Jordan Tannehill and William Ellis from VideoFag, a former queer art space in Toronto's Kensington Market, tell us that queer curating is about queering curation, about leveling the traditional hierarchies that have embedded themselves in art world relationships, finding new collaborative models, and seeking to support, listen, and learn from artists who find themselves on the margins. Queer curating is not only about adding sexual and gender minority content to exhibitions, though this is often a part of it. Instead, queer curating, like its namesake queer theory, is about calling into question practices that have long been considered normal, natural, or simply the way things are done. In questioning traditional structures, then, Tannehill and Ellis draw attention to the dismantling of hierarchies within the art world, creating forms of collaboration, and listening to marginalized people, including but not limited to sexual and gender minority people. Similarly, in the same discussion, Alison Mitchell and Deirdre Logue, founders of the Feminist Art Gallery in Toronto, explain that queering curation might entail dismissing, quote, the adoration of the notion of the curator, while enabling and nurturing an art system that is politically alive, accessible, DIY, and which centers experience. John Davies, who has curated shows in mainstream galleries, like Coming After, which I just told you about, as well as in queer community spaces, says that he is interested in the complex, affective, unanticipatable relationships between an artwork and an observer, and hopes to complicate distinctions between artists' lives and their work in queer curatorial practice. So I bring together these characteristics of queer curation with findings from my own research and define queer curation as collaborative and community engaged, politically and socially critical, as reimagining traditional forms and locations of curatorial practice, and with an attention to affect, as I've been talking about. So I want to illustrate this approach to queer curatorial practice through a specific case study. Tape condition Degraded was exhibited at the Archives, formerly known as the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, in Toronto in 2016. At the opening for Tape condition Degraded, you enter the gallery through a wall that has been smashed in. Inside, a time capsule of the 80s. A homey space complete with a giant hanging fern, a comfy chair in front of a small TV set, playing seemingly random scenes, and a variety of obsolete media equipment, many to record and screen video footage. In sharp contrast, to your right is a modern computer, a large flat iMac, playing explicit pornography. Around you, large metal racks holding everything from archival boxes to event posters. A jumbled mess. Kate McKinney and Hazel Meyer curated their collaborative and immersive installation, Tape Condition Degraded, to represent the archives as it was in the 1980s, when police raids of the space and of other local artist-run centers served as a warning that sexual expression was under attack in Toronto. The exhibit grapples with particular histories of the videotape, a medium on which most of the archive's moving image collections appear. In particular, McKinney and Meyer grapple with the pornography collections, the largest component of the moving image collections at the archives. Their focus on the process of curating this, on the communal nature of their curatorial practice, and the affective implications of curating something seemingly so personal as pornography are all part of what I am referring to today as queer curating. McKinney and Meyer describe their process of watching countless porn tapes they found in the archive in preparation for this exhibition. They were looking for something that they found sexy, but what they found was mostly cisgender, or in other words, not transgender, white, gay male porn. It was, they found, repetitive, formulaic, and overall pretty boring. In their work, they grapple with the disappointment of not finding themselves represented in this collection. McKinney and Meyer worked to fill in some of these silences through their curatorial practice, asking queer and transgender artists, and especially artists of color, to describe their so-called dream tapes, the porn tapes they wish were in the collections of the CLGA. The dream tapes create a fictional archive that demands physical presence within the archives, or at least the archives of the 80s that McKinney and Meyer created. Meyer drew the tapes of each of the contributors, creating an intersectional view of sexual desire within queer space. Despite McKinney and Meyer's disappointments in the CLGA's porn collections, they also recognize the importance of pornography, even the kinds they find boring, to larger queer communities. Porn, which now seems ubiquitous with the internet, has not always been so. Erotic images of same-sex sexuality have been hard to find. They entailed a process of searching, especially for those who kept their sexual identities quiet or who were in the process of exploring new forms of desire. Lucas Hildebrand describes the sociality of gay pornography tapes, which were often copied multiple times, with their image quality deteriorating with each copy made. These copies would be shared with friends and lovers, the relationships amongst marginalized people reflected in the deteriorating image. The evidence of social circulation of gay pornography also translates into the exhibition space. McKinney and Meyer staged the exhibition to be cozy and intimate. They remind us that pornography in queer communities has historically defined and reflected social relationships, and that this historical and social context to the medium is important to register within the exhibition space through the cozy location, which reflects the broader history of community-based queer archives. Community-based queer archives have often been housed in homey spaces. Growing out of communities, not institutions for the most part, queer collections have been built in community members' living rooms, their bedrooms. Many of the now more than 100 queer archives globally are not what you picture when you think about a traditional archive. Many, for instance, are still literally housed in the domestic space of the home. So one example is the Lesbian History Archives, which originated in the apartment of Joan Nessel in 1972. From their earliest inception, queer archives have been committed to welcoming the public into their collections and exhibiting their collections between and beyond their walls. Joan Nessel writes of the early days at the Lesbian History Archives when the collections filled every closet and corner of the apartment where she lived. She says, "My bedroom, the audiovisual room of the collection, my bed heavy with bodies, intent on studying the offered images, the erotics of it all, the fulfillment of want and longing for a touchable past." This is not what we often think of when we consider screen cultures. Many bodies, strangers piled on a bed watching films. The play between private and public never quite clear. Similarly, tape condition Degraded brought a group of people, strangers and friends, into a room with porn playing on a screen, on two screens really. The chair in front of Cowling's piece invited visitors to sit among the crowd. What does it mean to screen Cowling's work in the physical context of the exhibit, rather than watching it on YouTube, as one might do at home on a computer? I argue that the assumed individuality of consuming pornography has been troubled by queer viewing practices and must be troubled by queer curation. What I want to stress from this example is that context, by which I mean the politics of time and space, are inseparable from McKinney and Meyer's queer curatorial practice. In their exhibit, they work to incorporate the historical context of gay identity and pornography, the political context of the archives in terms of who is and who is not part of their porn collections, the spatial context of the building in which the archives are housed, and of the exhibition space in which visitors are invited to view the show, the social context of collective art practice built from their romantic relationships and friendships and community networks, and affective context linked with all of the above. So it is this thinking around curatorial practice, around community exchange of videotapes and audiovisual materials, the networks that expand beyond these geographically specific networks, that I want to bring to my work with Under the Shadow of Empire.